The old book slipped from the plus-size librarian's hands. A folded note fell onto the floor. The handsome businessman picked it up before anyone else could. He read one sentence. "If life ever gets better, I'll come back for this book." Then Roman Devereux stopped breathing. His fingers trembled around the yellowed paper. The room fell silent. Nobody understood why the city's most feared mafia boss stared at a 15-year-old note, as if it had just brought his past back to life. Roman Devereux did not look up from the note. Around him, the charity auction continued in uncertain fragments. Crystal glasses touched silver trays. Wealthy donors whispered beneath the library's vaulted ceiling. Somewhere near the entrance, a string quartet kept playing because no one had told them to stop. But Roman seemed to hear none of it. His attention remained fixed on the faded handwriting. Clara Winslow watched him from beside the display table. She had spent 15 years protecting that piece of paper. She had never imagined seeing someone recognize it. Roman finally lifted his eyes. "Where did you get this?" His voice was quiet, yet something in it made Clara straighten. She glanced at the worn novel in his other hand. "It belongs to the library." "That isn't what I asked." There was no anger in his tone, only urgency. Clara studied him for a moment. Most people knew Roman as the chairman of Devereux Holdings, a man whose name appeared on skyscrapers, hospitals, and charitable foundations. Others knew enough not to ask what existed behind that respectable empire. Clara knew only what mattered at that moment. The man holding the note looked nothing like someone powerful. He looked shaken. "That book was already overdue when I started working here," she said. 15 years ago. Roman's jaw tightened. Clara continued carefully. "The borrower never returned for it. Technically, we should have removed it from circulation years ago." "Why didn't you?" She gave the smallest shrug. "Because of the note." Roman looked down again. The paper had softened along its folds from the age. "You read it?" "I had to. It fell out once while I was repairing the binding." "And you kept it?" "I put it back exactly where I found it." Roman stared at her. Clara suddenly became aware of how strange the truth might sound. Every year, during the library's inventory review, the same forgotten novel appeared on the overdue list. Every year, someone suggested writing it off. And every year, Clara found a reason not to. At first, she had told herself it was simply procedure. Later, she stopped pretending. "There was something about those words," she said. "Whoever wrote them sounded like he needed to believe there would be a better version of his life someday." Roman's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "And you believed him?" Clara smiled faintly. "I believed he deserved the chance to keep his promise." For several seconds, Roman said nothing. Across the room, Evelyn Cross was watching them with open curiosity. Gregory Holt stood beside her, already irritated that the guest of honor had abandoned several important donors to speak with a librarian. Clara noticed them. Roman did not. His thumb moved over the edge of the old cover. There was tenderness in the gesture that didn't belong to the intimidating man everyone else saw. Then he asked, "Who was the borrower?" Clara hesitated. The original record was old enough that most of its information had never been transferred properly into the modern system. But she remembered the name. She had seen it every year for 15 years. "Roman Devereux." Silence settled between them. Clara's eyes widened. Roman met her gaze. No denial came. No explanation. Only the unmistakable truth. The lonely boy who had written that note had grown into the man standing before her. Roman closed the book slowly. "I'll return it properly." Clara blinked. Mr. Devereux. Technically, after 15 years, the late fee might require a payment plan. For the first time that evening, something almost like amusement touched his face. Almost. Then it disappeared. I think I can manage. He turned to leave, carrying the battered novel among men whose job was to protect things worth millions. But after several steps, Roman stopped. He looked back at Clara. For 15 years, countless people had passed through this library. Only one stranger had protected the promise of a boy she had never met. Roman held her gaze. "Why did you wait so long?" Clara answered simply. "Because the note didn't say he wasn't coming back." Roman stood perfectly still. It said he would. Roman did not open the book again until long after midnight. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by everything the boy who had once borrowed it could never have imagined owning. The room overlooked half the city. Buildings carrying the Devereux name rose against the dark skyline. Men waited downstairs for decisions that could change fortunes before morning. His phone had already collected messages from executives, politicians, and people who knew better than to call twice. Roman ignored them all. The battered novel rested on his desk. 15 years disappeared the moment he touched its cover. He had been 23 then, although hardship had made him feel much older. His father was already dead. His mother had followed less than a year later, after an illness Roman had watched consume both her health and the little money they had left. Family disappeared differently. Some died. Others simply stopped answering when there was nothing left to gain. By 23, Roman understood both kinds of loss. The library had been one of the few places where nobody asked him to buy anything. He could sit there for hours without explaining why his clothes were worn or why exhaustion followed him everywhere. Books demanded nothing. That was why he kept returning. And that was where he found the novel. He could no longer remember why he had chosen that particular story. Perhaps the title had appealed to him. Perhaps he had simply needed somewhere else to live for a few hundred pages. But he remembered the night he wrote the note. Rain had been striking the library windows. Roman had learned that the room he rented would no longer be his by the end of the week. He had no stable job, no parents, almost no money, and no convincing reason to believe tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. Before leaving, he opened the novel to its final page and stared at the ending. The characters had survived. Their lives had changed. Some foolish part of him had wanted proof that his could change too. So he found a scrap of paper and wrote, "If life ever gets better, I'll come back for this book." He folded it, placed it inside, and walked away. Roman had intended to return. Then survival became louder than promises. Within days he left the neighborhood. Within months he had entered a world where weakness was expensive and trust was even more dangerous. Years followed. Roman learned how power worked. He learned that fear could open doors, kindness could not. He built businesses, alliances, and eventually an empire respectable enough to place his photograph on financial magazines, while ensuring another version of his name was spoken much more carefully after dark. The frightened young man disappeared beneath tailored suits and controlled silence. Roman told himself that boy no longer existed, until Clara Winslow dropped a book. He opened it now. The pages smelled faintly of paper, dust, and time. His note remained exactly where he had hidden it. Not thrown away. Not laughed at. Not forgotten. Protected. Roman leaned back and closed his eyes. Of all the people who had entered his life since then, how many had stayed because they expected something from him? Money, protection, influence, access. Fear had purchased loyalty more efficiently than affection ever had. Yet somewhere across the city, a librarian who did not know his face had spent 15 years protecting the promise of a penniless stranger. That realization disturbed him more deeply than any threat ever had. A knock sounded. His longtime security chief opened the study door only after Roman gave permission. "Everything all right?" Roman looked at the old book. For once, he did not know how to answer. His gaze settled on the handwriting again. Life had gotten better, at least according to every measurement the younger Roman would have understood. He had money, power, a home no landlord could take away, people who feared losing him. But the note had asked a question his empire could not answer. Had his life truly become better, or had he merely become harder? Roman closed the cover. His thoughts returned to Clara's face when she said the note never claimed its owner would not return. No judgment, no attempt to impress him, just certainty. Roman had forgotten a promise he made when he possessed almost nothing. A woman he had never met had remembered it for him. He rose from his chair. "Clear my schedule tomorrow morning." His security chief paused. "You have the Holston meeting at 9. Move it." "What should I put on the calendar?" Roman picked up the book. For the first time in 15 years, he knew exactly where he needed to be. The library. Clara was shelving returned books the next morning when the library became unusually quiet. She did not need to turn around to know why. People behaved differently around powerful men. Conversations softened, backs straightened, eyes followed without appearing to stare. Roman Devereux walked toward her, carrying the old novel. He had come without the spectacle of the previous evening. No charity guests, no cameras. Only one discreet security man remained near the entrance. Clara placed another book onto the shelf. "You came back." Roman stopped. The words affected him more than she intended. "So it seems." Clara noticed the novel in his hand. "Are you returning it?" "Not yet." That surprised her. Roman looked around the reading room. Morning light rested across rows of wooden tables scarred by generations of readers. "Where do you keep it all these years?" "In circulation at first. Later, in preservation storage." "Why?" Clara smiled. "You already asked me that." "I don't think you gave me the whole answer." Most people would have found his persistence intimidating. Clara found it strangely sincere. She led him toward a quiet corner near the old reference shelves. "When I first found the note, I was 17. Roman stared at her. "You were 17? A volunteer." Suddenly, the 15 years meant something different. Clara had not inherited someone else's decision. She had made it herself. She explained that during an inventory cleanup, staff had been sorting abandoned and damaged books. The novel had been scheduled for removal because its borrower had disappeared, and the account was inactive. Then Clara found the note. She remembered reading it twice. Not because the sentence was extraordinary, but because it sounded painfully honest. "At 17, Clara said, "I thought adults always knew what they were doing." Roman almost smiled. That illusion didn't last? About 3 weeks. A quiet laugh escaped him. It was brief, but genuine. Clara continued. She had asked Margaret Ellis, then the head librarian, whether they could keep the book. Margaret warned her that libraries could not preserve every abandoned object because someone attached a story to it. Clara understood, but she offered to take responsibility for this one. Every year afterward, when the old record resurfaced, Clara renewed it. As systems changed, she made sure the record survived the transfers. When administrative fees appeared, she quietly covered them herself. Roman's expression hardened. "You paid them?" They weren't very large. For 15 years. Clara looked uncomfortable now, as though generosity embarrassed her more than praise pleased her. It sounds ridiculous when you say it like that. No. His answer came immediately. It doesn't. Clara looked at him. Roman had spent years surrounded by people who measured favors carefully. Nobody gave without calculating what might return. Clara had invested 15 years in a stranger who could offer her absolutely nothing. Did you really believe I would come back? He asked. She considered the question. Not exactly. Roman's brow tightened. Clara rested one hand against the shelf. I believe the person who wrote that note needed someone to take his promise seriously. Roman said nothing. Maybe he would return, she continued. Maybe he wouldn't. But throwing the book away felt like deciding his story was over for him. Something inside Roman shifted. He had spent his adult life ensuring nobody could decide his fate. Yet when he had been powerless, a 17-year-old girl had unknowingly refused to let the world erase one small piece of him. You didn't know anything about me. No. I could have become a terrible person. Clara's quiet humor returned. I'm a librarian, Mr. Devereux. We generally wait until the final chapter before reviewing the character. Roman looked at her for several seconds. Then he smiled. Not the controlled expression used for photographs. A real smile. It transformed him enough that Clara momentarily forgot why half the city feared his name. Then footsteps approached. Gregory Holt appeared at the end of the aisle. Evelyn Cross was beside him. Both had seen Roman smiling at Clara, and neither looked pleased. Roman noticed them, but his attention returned to the woman before him. For the first time in years, someone interested him without wanting anything he possessed. Not his wealth, not his influence, not his protectio. Clara had cared about him when she believed he was nobody. That made her kindness impossible to purchase, and therefore, to Roman, priceless. By afternoon, Clara's kindness had become an accusation. Gregory Holt summoned her to the boardroom before her lunch break ended. Evelyn Cross was already seated beside him. On the polished table lay copies of the old borrowing record, preservation reports, and 15 years of renewal entries. Gregory folded his hands. Clara, we need to discuss an irregularity. She sat opposite him. If this is about Mr. Devereux's book, I can explain. That is precisely the problem, Evelyn said. You seem very prepared to explain. Clara looked at her. Evelyn had spent years advising museums and private collectors. She understood the value of rare objects, wealthy donors, and proximity to powerful men. What she did not understand was why Roman Devereux had ignored an entire room of influential people for a librarian. The book should have been removed from the system years ago, Gregory said. Instead, you repeatedly interfered with its status. I preserved it, without authorization, with Margaret Ellis's knowledge. Margaret retired 8 years ago. That doesn't make those years disappear. Gregory's expression tightened. Clara understood what was happening. This was no longer about a book. For months, she had opposed Gregory's proposal to sell portions of the historic collection to private investors. She believed public books belonged where the public could reach them. Gregory considered her resistance inconvenient. Now he had found a weakness. Evelyn leaned forward. And then, quite remarkably, the forgotten borrower turns out to be Roman Devereux. Clara remained still. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting 15 years is a very long time to maintain an unauthorized record. It is, and a very convenient story. Clara's cheeks warmed, but her voice remained level. You believe I somehow knew a broke 23-year-old library patron would become one of the wealthiest men in the city. Evelyn did not answer directly. Instead, she smiled. I believe people become creative when powerful men notice them. That hurt more than Clara expected. Not because she cared what Evelyn thought of her, because something private and decent had been turned into something cheap. Gregory slid a document across the table. Until we complete an internal review, you'll be temporarily removed from preservation duties. Clara looked at the paper. 15 years of work reduced to a paragraph. Am I suspended? Not presently. Then I'll return to the circulation desk. Her calmness unsettled them. Evelyn had expected embarrassment. Gregory had expected fear. Clara gave them neither. She stood. If you investigate the records, investigate all of them. Gregory frowned. What does that mean? It means don't stop when you find something that supports the conclusion you already want. Then Clara left. She made it halfway down the corridor before allowing herself to breathe deeply. For the first time, doubt entered. Perhaps she had been foolish. Perhaps keeping one forgotten book for 15 years had crossed some invisible professional line. But she knew why she had done it, and she refused to be ashamed of that. By evening, whispers had spread through the library. Some staff avoided mentioning the investigation. Others became excessively kind, which somehow felt worse. Then Roman arrived. He immediately noticed Clara behind the circulation desk, instead of among the historic collections. What happened? Internal review. His face changed. Because of the book? Clara hesitated. That's part of it. Who? The single word carried enough coldness to remind her exactly who Roman was. Clara met his eyes. No. Roman paused. No. I know what people say about you, Mr. Devereux, and I know you're accustomed to solving problems. His expression became unreadable. But this one is mine. They're attacking your integrity because of me. Then let them examine my integrity. Roman stepped closer. You don't have to face this alone. Clara's voice softened. There's a difference between standing beside someone and fighting their battle for them. For a moment, neither moved. Roman understood. Respecting Clara meant resisting the instinct to destroy every obstacle placed before her. So he nodded. But when he turned toward the boardroom, there was something dangerous in his composure. He would not silence Gregory Holt. He would not threaten Evelyn Cross. He would do something neither expected. He would let the truth speak, and make certain the entire city heard it. The investigation was scheduled for Friday morning. By 9 o'clock, every seat in the library boardroom was occupied. Gregory Holt sat at the head of the table, with 3 board members beside him. Evelyn Cross had been invited as an outside collections advisor. Clara sat alone at the opposite end. Roman stood near the back. He had refused a chair. His presence made everyone aware that whatever happened inside that room would not remain a small administrative matter. Gregory opened a folder. Our concern is straightforward. Ms. Winslow maintained an inactive borrowing record for 15 years, preserved library property outside normal procedure, and personally interfered with fees associated with that record. Clara listened without interruption. Gregory continued. The question is whether those actions constitute professional misconduct. They do not. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Margaret Ellis walked into the room carrying an old archival box. At 71, the retired head librarian moved more slowly than Clara remembered, but her eyes remained sharp. Clara stood. Margaret. Margaret smiled at her. You didn't think I'd let you take all the blame for something I approved, did you? Gregory's expression darkened. This is an internal board proceeding. and I was head librarian when the relevant decisions were made. Margaret placed the box on the table. So perhaps you should investigate the history before rewriting it. She removed several folders. The first contained inventory reports from 15 years earlier. The second held handwritten authorization forms. The third contained receipts. Dozens of them. Margaret placed the oldest receipt before Gregory. Clara found the book during her first year volunteering here. She requested permission to preserve it until its borrower returned. Gregory examined the document. This only authorizes temporary preservation. Correct. Margaret produced another. So I renewed the authorization. Then another. And again. The records continued across the table, year after year. Different forms, different administrative systems, the same book, the same borrower, the same young librarian refusing to let the record disappear. Evelyn crossed her arms. That still doesn't explain the fees. Margaret looked at Clara. No, those were her idea. She opened a smaller envelope. Inside were payment receipts carrying Clara Winslow's name. The room became silent. Whenever an administrative penalty threatened to force the book from the active system, Clara had paid it herself. $5, $8, $12, small amounts individually. 15 years of them together. She never charged the library, Margaret said. She never claimed reimbursement, and she never knew who Roman Devereux would become. Evelyn's face tightened. That cannot be proven. Roman finally moved. He walked toward the table and placed the battered novel beside the records. Yes, it can. Every eye turned toward him. When I borrowed this book, I had no company, no influence, no money worth mentioning. His voice remained controlled. I was a young man who had recently buried his family and had no idea where he would be living the following month. Clara looked at him. Roman had never spoken so openly about that part of his life, especially not in front of strangers. He picked up the old note. This handwriting is mine. Nobody interrupted. I wrote this because I needed to believe my circumstances were temporary. Then I left and forgot about it. His eyes shifted toward Clara. She didn't. Gregory cleared his throat. Mr. Devereux, nobody is questioning your history. No, you're questioning hers. The room went still. Roman could have threatened Gregory. Everyone knew it. Instead, he did something more devastating. He pointed to the documents. You have 15 years of records, signed authorizations, receipts, a retired head librarian willing to testify, yet you chose suspicion before evidence. Gregory's face reddened. Roman's voice never rose. That is not an investigation. That is a conclusion looking for permission. Clara watched him carefully. He was defending her without taking the battle away from her, exactly as she had asked. Gregory turned toward the other board members. A quiet discussion followed. It did not last long. The evidence left little room for interpretation. Clara had violated no policy under the procedures authorized during Margaret's tenure. Her preservation privileges were restored immediately. But Margaret was not finished. She pulled one final folder from the box. These are Gregory Holt's proposed sale documents. Gregory froze. Clara looked up. Margaret continued. The same historic collection, Ms. Winslow has repeatedly argued should remain publicly accessible. Now the timing of the investigation looked very different. One board member slowly closed Gregory's file. Another requested a separate review of the proposed sales. For the first time that morning, Gregory had nothing to say. Outside the boardroom, Clara stopped beside Roman. You listened. Roman looked at her. To what? when I told you not to fight my battle for me. I considered ignoring you. Clara smiled. I assumed you might. But you were right. He glanced through the glass doors toward the old reading room. Power can force people to become quiet. It cannot make a lie become true. Clara studied him. The feared man before her had possessed every weapon necessary to frighten her accusers. Instead, he had trusted evidence, trusted Margaret, trusted her. "Thank you," she said. Roman shook his head. "You kept one promise alive for 15 years. His gaze settled on her with an intensity that made the hallway seem suddenly smaller. The least I could do was protect the truth about the woman who kept it. 3 weeks after the investigation, Roman asked Clara to meet him in the oldest wing of the library. The section had been closed for nearly a decade. Water stains marked the ceiling. Several windows had been boarded over, and shelves, once filled with children's books, stood beneath protective sheets. Clara found Roman in the center of the room. Architectural drawings covered an old reading table. She stopped. "What have you done?" Roman glanced at the plans. "Nothing yet." "That usually means something expensive is about to happen." His mouth curved slightly. She had learned to recognize that expression. It appeared more often around her now. Roman turned one of the drawings toward her. Devereux Holdings would finance the restoration of the entire historic wing. Not purchase it. Not rename the library after him. Restore it. The original architecture would remain. Damaged shelves would be repaired instead of replaced where possible. A preservation laboratory would be added downstairs, along with expanded public reading areas. But the largest space had another purpose. Clara studied the drawing. Low bookshelves, reading corners, free tutoring rooms, desks beside wide windows. What is this? A place for children who need somewhere to go. She looked at him. Roman's gaze moved toward the boarded windows. When I was young, the library was the only building where I could stay for hours without someone asking why I was there. His voice was quieter now. Nobody needed to know I couldn't afford dinner. Nobody asked why I kept reading until closing. Clara said nothing. Roman rarely spoke about his past, unless the book forced the memory from him. "The city has shelters," he continued, "programs, charities. But sometimes a child doesn't need someone to tell him he's unfortunate." He looked around the abandoned room. Sometimes he needs somewhere he can simply exist. Clara understood immediately. Not a monument to Roman Devereux, a refuge for the boy he had been. She looked again at the plans. "It's beautiful." "It isn't finished." Roman slid another document toward her. At the top was a proposed title. "The second chapter, Reading Room." Clara smiled. Subtle. "I was advised against calling it the 15-year late fee memorial." She laughed. Roman watched her longer than necessary. Over the past weeks, he had found reasons to visit the library that had very little to do with books. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes Clara discovered him sitting quietly in the reading room, answering emails between shelves instead of from his office. Neither of them named what was developing. It did not need a name yet. For Roman, that was unfamiliar. He had built his life by deciding quickly what things were worth and acting before anyone else could. Clara could not be approached that way. Her trust was not something to acquire. It had to be earned slowly. Roman tapped the final page of the proposal. "There's one condition." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I knew it. I want you to direct it." Her smile vanished. "Roman, you understand what this place is supposed to be. There are people with more experience running youth programs. There are people with more experience managing budgets." He paused. There aren't many people who would protect a stranger's hope for 15 years. Clara looked down at the plans. The offer was larger than a promotion. It was the opportunity to build the kind of space she had always believed a library should be, but she also knew what people would say. You realize this will look like favoritism. Then don't accept because I asked. Roman's answer surprised her. He pushed a folder toward her. Inside was a formal selection process. Independent board oversight, external reviewers, published qualifications. You apply, he said. They decide. Clara slowly looked up. You arranged that? You told me there's a difference between helping someone and deciding for them. A warmth moved through her that had nothing to do with gratitude. Roman had listened again. Months later, after an independent committee selected Clara unanimously, restoration began. Roman came often, not as the feared mafia boss whispered about across the city, not even as the chairman whose money funded the project. He came as a man learning how to return to a place he had once abandoned. On the day workers removed the boards from the largest window, sunlight poured into the forgotten room. Clara stood beside him as dust shimmered in the light. Roman held the old novel. I used to sit over there. He pointed toward a corner. Clara imagined him younger, alone, reading until someone announced closing time. Without thinking, she touched his hand. Roman went still. Her fingers remained there. No dramatic confession followed. No hurried kiss. Neither needed one. For a man who had built his life around control, allowing someone close enough to witness what still hurt was intimacy enough. Roman turned his hand beneath hers. Their fingers slowly intertwined. And for the first time since returning to the library, Roman understood something the boy who wrote that note never could. Keeping a promise did not always mean returning to the place you left. Sometimes it meant finally becoming the person who could stay. The second chapter. Reading room opened on a quiet Saturday morning. Roman could have turned the occasion into a spectacle. He could have invited reporters, politicians, donors, and every executive who wanted to shake his hand in front of a camera. Instead, at Clara's request, the first guests were children. By noon, every new table was occupied. Some read, some drew. One little girl sat beneath a window with a book almost too large for her lap. Roman watched from the doorway. There had been a time when rooms like this were the closest thing he had to safety. Now children entered without knowing who paid for the shelves or repaired the roof. Clara had insisted that was exactly how it should be. The room belonged to them, not to him. Roman found her later in the old reading room. She was returning books to a shelf after the opening. You know you're the director now, he said. You can ask someone else to do that. Clara glanced over her shoulder. And lose the opportunity to alphabetize? A terrifying prospect. She smiled. Roman had changed in ways most people would never notice. He still commanded rooms without raising his voice. Men still became cautious when his name appeared on their phones. But Clara knew the smaller changes. He no longer sat with his back to every wall. He occasionally laughed, without immediately controlling the sound. He had started reading again. Not business reports, books. Sometimes he even returned them on time. Usually. Clara slid the final volume into place. Roman held the old novel in his hand. She recognized it immediately. You still haven't returned that. I was waiting. For what? Roman looked toward the table where, 15 years earlier, a desperate young man had written a promise to himself. For the right ending. Clara became quiet. Roman opened the book. The folded note remained on the final page. I spent most of my life believing survival was enough, he said. Clara listened. When you lose enough people, you learn not to build your life around anything that can leave. There was no self-pity in his voice, only recognition. So I built things instead. Companies, property, influence. Things you could control. Yes. His eyes met hers. Then I met someone I couldn't. Clara's lips curved. That must have been traumatic. It remains extremely inconvenient. She laughed softly. Roman did too. Then his expression grew serious. I forgot my promise. Clara looked at the old note. The sentence had survived longer than the hope that created it. She remembered being 17, holding that same piece of paper and wondering what had happened to the stranger who wrote it. Now he stood before her, older, harder, imperfect, but here. So I remembered it for both of us. Roman stared at her. Clara had said the words simply, yet they reached somewhere. Money, fear, and power never had. He stepped closer. Why? She could have answered with something easy. Because it was the right thing to do. Because she loved books. Because she was stubborn. All were true. None were the truth he was asking for now. Because everyone deserves to know that being forgotten once doesn't mean they'll be forgotten forever. Roman lowered his eyes. For a moment, the feared mafia boss disappeared. Clara saw only the boy who had sat alone among these shelves. She reached for his hand. This time, Roman didn't hesitate. I don't know how to do this well, he admitted. What? Need someone? Clara's fingers tightened around his. You don't have to be good at something before you begin. That sounds suspiciously like librarian philosophy. It's available in several volumes. Roman smiled. Then he lifted his free hand and gently touched her cheek. He gave her every opportunity to move away. Clara stayed. Their first kiss was quiet. No audience, no grand declaration. Just two people standing between shelves where a forgotten promise had waited long enough for both of them. When they separated, Roman rested his forehead against hers. I came back for the book. Clara smiled. No. He looked at her. You came back because the person who wrote that note was still somewhere inside you. Roman considered that. And if I want to stay? Her answer came softly. Then stay. Outside the room, children turned pages beneath the restored windows. Inside it, Roman finally understood that his story had never ended when he walked away 15 years ago. Someone had simply been holding his place. 1 year later, the second chapter reading room no longer looked new. That was exactly how Clara wanted it. The chairs had scratches, the tables carried pencil marks, hundreds of books had been borrowed, returned, recommended, argued over, and borrowed again. On a rainy afternoon, Roman stood beside Clara at the circulation desk, while a nervous boy approached carrying a library card. He could not have been older than 11. In his hands was the first book he had ever checked out. Clara scanned it. You have 3 weeks. The boy nodded solemnly. And if I'm late? Roman looked at Clara. She fought a smile. We have some experience with that. The boy tucked the book beneath his arm and hurried toward the doors. Roman watched him leave. For a moment he saw another young man walking through those same doors 15 years earlier. Alone, afraid, certain that disappearing was easier than hoping. But this memory no longer hurt in the same way. Some wounds did not vanish. They simply stopped deciding what came next. Roman turned toward Clara. A year together had not transformed him into someone unrecognizable. He was still reserved, still formidable, still a man whose silence could change the temperature of a room. But now there were Sunday mornings with Clara, books beside his bed, dinner with Margaret twice a month, and a reading room full of children who knew him simply as Roman. He reached inside his coat and removed the old folded note. Clara stared at it. "You've been carrying that. For 15 years you had your turn." He placed it in her palm. "Thank you." Clara looked up. "For what? For believing a stranger would come back?" Her expression softened. "You did come back. Eventually. Your late fee remains under review." Roman smiled. Clara opened a new book resting on the desk. She slipped the old note carefully between its final pages. Roman raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" "Giving it a new home. That belongs in an archive." "Probably." "Clara." She closed the cover. "You spent 15 years learning that not everything valuable needs to be locked away." Roman had no argument for that. He took her hand. Outside, rain tapped softly against the restored windows. Inside, another child laughed between the shelves. Roman looked at the woman who had remembered him before she knew him, defended his forgotten promise when it had no value, and loved him without asking him to become someone else first. The boy who wrote the note had promised to return if life ever got better. Roman finally understood. Better had never meant richer. It had never meant powerful. It meant having somewhere worth returning to, someone worth staying for. He kissed Clara softly, and somewhere inside, a new book, an old promise, waited on the final page. Not because their story was over, but because, after 15 years, they were finally ready to begin the next chapter.